Hello, welcome to World Civilizations since 1500. Now, today we're starting the second session of the seventh topic of the semester titled World Revolutions, Mexico, Russia, and China. Now, what we're going to be doing here in this session is we're going to continue looking at the alternative visions of modernity, mainly just looking at some elements of the communist ideology that we were looking at the end of session one. And we're going to be then after that moving into the very first revolution itself, which is the Mexican Revolution. We're going to do that for a great part of this session. And then towards the end, we're going to be moving into the beginning stages of the Russian Revolution as well. Okay, so let us go to our outline so we can start with some elements of the communist ideology devised by the German philosopher who lived in the 19th century, early part of the 19th century, Karl Marx, who was really a critical thinker in terms of providing really an analysis of this emergent system, the rapid industrialization that was taking place in England and also in Germany and elsewhere, was really bringing a series of changes to human societies. And he's really trying to analyze the changes and trying to offer an explanation for how economic systems arise in history. And so, as I mentioned, after all, he's going to devise a sociological theory that kind of explained the evolution of economic systems. So he's really providing just that. Again, pretty much the evolution of economic systems. And he really believes that this is what's really driving history forward. It's really economics. The formation of economic systems really is what establishes the basis of human societies, whether we're talking about not only the economy itself, of course, but also the political system. The economy is going to also, to a very great extent, bring about the legal system and also the religious institutions as well. All of them are actually expressions of the economy, he believed. And really, what he's actually suggesting here, as I mentioned, is that throughout history, there's always been two main classes of people that conform the economy. And those are masters on one hand, and the other ones are the laborers or the producers on the other. Okay, so he really believes that this is the way that economic systems have been formed over time. And since the very beginning of economic systems in world history, economic systems tended to be very, very harsh. For example, slavery. This is the beginning stages of an economic system. We got, of course, the slave owners, the master class, and of course the producers were the slaves. And this is how people organized in order to produce what needed to be produced. That system evolved, and after thousands of years, that gave rise to another system called feudalism, a less harsh system. This is not as exploitative, but it's still harsh. Feudalism, again, that divided people between landowners and commoners or serfs or peasants that needed to pay rent to the landowners. And this is how things were getting done. Now, he believes that after feudalism comes capitalism. And once again, we see two main classes of people, the master class, the industrial owners, and the producers or the laborers or the proletariat or, the workers and the industrial working class, in other words. And what he really believed is that ultimately capitalism, just like the systems of the past, was going to run out of gas and really evolve, so to speak, and create a different system, which he believed was not going to have those two main classes of people in clash with one another. He believed that history ultimately was moving humanity, in other words, into a utopian future, this idealized future in which there will be no social classes whatsoever, what he called a classless society, because if we still have those two classes of people, the masters and the producers, there's always going to be exploitation at whatever the degree of the exploitation might be, but there will always be differences, inequalities in wealth, distribution of wealth will be very unequal, and so there's of course exploitation. So he believed that ultimately in the future, again, that there will be this idealized society with no social classes whatsoever, and that this was going to come through revolution, he believed. Again, so this is again very important, and this idealized future he believed that was going to be one in which people will be freed from the burdens of labor by the fact that the Industrial Revolution was producing miracles, he believed, the machine age, that all this machinery, the fact that now machines are replacing human labor, that everything in the future, he believed, will be manufactured through mechanical devices and gadgets and so on, that this is going to free up, in other words, humanity from the burdens of labor, and people will be pursuing other goals. They're going to be growing as human beings in creative ways, exploring their own talents and gifts in many areas, in art and science and in intellectual pursuits and so on. That, again, this is going to be kind of like utopian future, and in order to accomplish that, he believed that it was going to be necessary to abolish private property again, because when private property exists, when individuals own property, they deprive others from accessing resources. So it is impossible to create an equitable society, he believed, as long as private property is present. So again, this is his vision of the future, and why this is important is because those ideas, not only communism, but also socialism and anarcho-syndicalism, are going to provide a source of inspiration for many of the participants and actors of the revolutions that we're about to explore in this topic, like the Mexican, Russian, and Chinese. Okay, they wanted to implement, in other words, elements of those ideologies and create a new society based on those ideas. Now, let's look at now part two. Part two is going to look at the Mexican Revolution. We're now examining the very first revolution of the modern world, of the 20th century. It's very important to note that the 20th century opened up in this way. There were many high hopes and expectations prior to the opening of this century in terms of, we're really moving into a new era. This is the era of progress that we were going to experience and witness, the creation of a new world that was going to be better than all the previous eras of the past. But the reality was that as this world opened up, the 20th century, it opened up with a series of uprisings and revolutions, and of course, world wars as well. This is something that we're gonna get to see and explore in the next topic after this. But sufficient to say that, again, the 20th century opens up with revolutionary upheaval, and that many of those revolutionary movements and upheavals that plagued the world throughout the 20th century were reactions against modernity. I stressed this at the beginning of session 1, that the revolutions that we're about to see and many of the other ones that occurred throughout this century were responses and reactions against this process of modernization. Okay, rejecting capitalism, for example, rejecting the liberal values, for example, of the Enlightenment in many cases, particularly cultural values like, feminism, for example, and individualism and the like. All right, so let us here begin with the Mexican Revolution by offering a quick overview of the origins and background. Now, in the previous topic, when we talked about modernization, I provided a very extensive analysis of modernization in Mexico, starting with the liberal reforms that began to be implemented as soon as Mexico obtained its independence from Spain in 1821. Okay, so when Mexico becomes independent, we're going to see that Mexico was torn apart between two ideological camps, two factions, the liberals and the conservatives. So again, I'm not going to repeat everything I said in the previous topic, but what should be remembered is that the liberals really wanted to create Mexico along the lines of, let us just say, the U.S. and Great Britain. Again, trying to create a liberal economy based on capitalism. They wanted the creation of private enterprises. They were also looking at the possibility much, much later at industrialization as well, and creating a middle class in the process and a true vibrant and dynamic capitalist economy overall. The conservatives, again, wanted the same, but they wanted to slow down and create, very gradual changes that, again, will not disrupt the social order. But the liberals really want to accelerate this process, and they're insistent in doing so. And it is really in the 1850s that they're going to introduce the very first series of laws and reforms to try to speed up this process. This is something that occurred in the 1850s, again, in a period of time known in Mexican history as La Reforma, or the reform period. The leader of the liberals, who's going to seize power, become president of Mexico, and push this agenda of trying to institute capitalism and a commercial economy and private property, trying to turn the landed estates, particularly those land holdings of the church and the villages, the peasant land holdings, into private property. Again, to invite investors and merchants to use those lands for commercial production, particularly growing cash crops. So Benito Juárez introduced a piece of legislation known as Ley Lerdo, the law of Lerdo. He was one of the important cabinet members of his administration, Lerdo, and he's going to be the author of this law Lerdo, or Ley Lerdo in this case, in which the main objective, once again, was to create large landed estates, or haciendas in this case. Those are the equivalent of what in the U.S. was, for example, the plantation system, in other words, okay? For exports, to grow cash crops for exports, a number of different products like cotton, for example, to grow sugar, to grow coffee, Heineken as well. So this is what Juárez and the liberals are attempting to do. They're trying to foster economic development and to create those commercial enterprises, agricultural companies, in other words, otherwise known as the hacienda. And so to do that, it was required then to privatize the village land holdings, otherwise known as the ejido. I mean, this is the traditional way of organizing the land according to native tradition, indigenous traditions, in other words, that the land is owned in common. There's no private property. Again, there's a group of people, villagers, that own the land in common, and that type of system was known in Mexico as ejido. It was known by the Aztecs as the calpulli as well, and the Mayas used to call it the caj. Okay, the caj. And those are, again, this is the village land, in other words, that is owned by all the members. And what the liberals are saying is that most of this land is not being used, is just sitting there in idle, and they wanted to make it productive, so they want to sell it, in other words, in the market. So the Ley Lerdo was a direct assault on the village land holdings, in trying to dismantle them. And of course, what this is going to cause is, of course, the displacement of the indigenous population, and in turn, being totally landless and without any possibility of providing a subsistence for their own families and communities, they will have to now turn to wage labor, of course. They'll have to now work for an hacendado, a landowner, for a wage, growing cash crops instead of growing their own food. So this is really taking away not only their land entitlements, but also their cultural independence as well, their economic future as well. Now, part of this process of trying to institute a liberal economy in Mexico and trying to modernize it was the idea that the way to accelerate modernization in Mexico was to bring in foreign investors. In this case, they're thinking about Americans. Again, Americans, inviting American aid and investment, opening the doors to the Americans to come in and bring their capital and technology in order to foster development. The development of industries and railroads, to develop the creation also of a number of different agricultural enterprises and companies and the like, that they were going to actually, in other words, transform Mexico into what today we'll call, for example, we will call this a first world country, in other words. Of course, those terms had not yet been created, but this is the idea of the liberals. And the person that is going to open the doors wide for the Americans to come in was a liberal himself, Porfirio Diaz, who seizes power in 1876. And he really remained in power all the way to 1910. So he really created a dictatorship, in Mexico. He himself was quite charismatic. He had been considered a hero in Mexico for participating in the expulsion of the French during the French intervention. Something we discussed in the past when the French were attempting to turn Mexico into a French colony. Again, Porfirio Diaz, becomes really a war hero and becomes a president in 1876. Now, his idea was that the way to accomplish modernity or modernization was by establishing, first and foremost, social order. He ruled with an iron fist. He was really an authoritarian who ruled the country forcefully in order to implement his reforms, his liberal reforms. He's a liberal, remember. His motto was order and progress. We cannot really progress without order. And so he tried to quell rebellions everywhere. He ruled with the military in order to implement his needed changes that, from his perspective, were going to turn Mexico into a whole new country. And what is significant to note here, however, is that a great part of his success in seizing power, for example, and remaining in power, was the blessing, in this case, of Americans. In other words, he had the full support, in other words, of American interests, particularly people like James Stillman, for example, who was the head of Citigroup of New York, of Citibank, in other words. So he had the financial backing, he had the support of New York financiers in order to remain not only in power, but also to open the doors for Americans to come in and start developing the economy, whether we're talking about industries, for example, or railroads and etc., a number of different industries. And this is exactly what Diaz did. As soon as he arrives to Mexico in 1876 to power, he starts passing a series of laws like the mining law, for example. The mining law was a law to start really developing the mining industry. It was already quite developed in Mexico, but it really was still very rudimentary. It was not high tech, so to speak. So he wanted the Americans to bring their technologies to develop it. So he opened the doors for the Guggenheim, for example, brothers, who had created a mining empire globally. And so he invited this company, the Guggenheim, to develop the copper and the silver industry. We're also seeing the development, for example, of the American Smelting and Refining Company as well in Mexico. Again, so those interests, of course, were all intertied, interlinked, intertwined. And so Americans are now in Mexico transforming the mining industry, revolutionizing it. Of course, they're bringing their ideas, their know-how. And again, this is what Diaz considers to be totally necessary. The other law, again, those are actually liberal reforms, was called the Survey Law. And what the Survey Law implemented was to start selling land to American corporations, in this case, agricultural companies, in order to grow massive amounts of grain as well. So here with the Survey Law, we see the opening for the international harvester, for example, the Agriculture International Harvester Corporation coming into Mexico and beginning this process of buying land in Mexico. Again, so this is what Diaz is doing. He's not just inviting the Americans to come in and develop those industries. He's also, in many cases, selling the mineral resources, land to the Americans. So the Americans are pretty much in possession of those resources, again, as they're developing those industries. He's also very interested in building railroads. And this is, again, another policy of trying to invite American railroad companies to come in and develop the railroad. And here we're going to see the Southern Pacific Railroad brought into Mexico to pretty much build all the rail lines across Mexico. Now, the purpose to do this was not just to have transportation for the sake of transportation, but rather that, well, yes, this is going to accelerate commerce and trade within Mexico. There's no denying about that. Again, so producers in Mexico will have now the ability to ship their goods to the cities, to the marketplace. But most importantly, the sign was that now the resources that are being mined and extracted in Mexico by American companies will find markets in the United States as well. The idea was to transport, again, those mineral resources, whether we're talking about copper or, we're talking about silver, agricultural products, or we're talking about iron ore or coal or timber or oil, etc., that all of that will reach North America, again, where those resources are going to be processed and turned into finished products and finished goods. Again, so that was necessary to build the railroad. This is, again, the main idea. Again, at least from the perspective of American companies, again, this is their main goal. We also see the introduction, of course, of banking. For example, J.P. Morgan was instrumental in coming into Mexico to provide loans to the Diaz government, for the Diaz government to transform the Mexican economy as well, to foster development. That's another, again, opening for American aid and investment. We also see the development of the oil company in the Gulf of Mexico. Oil was discovered in the Gulf of Mexico, and we're going to see here the entrance of an American company, the Standard Oil of New Jersey. I mean, this company is going to come in and develop the Mexican oil industry. Overall, Diaz stayed in power for about 34 years, and throughout this period of time, Americans will end up investing about $1 billion of that day. Again, so this is a huge, massive investment of capital into Mexico to transform it. And indeed, we see indeed a certain modernization and transformation taking place in the country. But when we talk about, for example, social development or even economic growth at the local grassroots community and family level, we're going to see, of course, stagnation there. We see, of course, transformation because there's now, of course, an infusion of capital, there's railroads, and there's industries and the like. But the fact is that the Mexican masses remain pretty much impoverished. We're not going to see much change there in that level. So obviously, there's going to be a reaction to this process of modernization in Mexico. Okay, there's going to be a reaction, and that reaction took place on many fronts. For example, we see, number one, that with this process, Mexican society will become increasingly divided between two social groups or two social classes overall. Mexican society is now composed of a two-tier social system. On one hand, we got the wealthy landed elite, high concentrations of wealth, again, in the hands of maybe 100 families or so in Mexico. And virtually the rest of Mexican society are composed of peasants. Now, it is true that there are some middle class groups, but they're not really a class unto themselves. They're just very, very limited, very, very few, again, individuals that can be considered members of the middle class. The vast majority of the Mexican masses are peasants. And like I said, a great many peasants have been losing their entitlements to land. Number two, the fact is that a great many people in Mexico, because they were growing their own food, sustaining their own communities, they had cultural independence to perpetuate their traditions and language and beliefs and practices and so on. Now, all of this is being lost. And as the peasantry is losing ground and losing land, and also they're being driven into those enterprises to work for haciendas for meager wages in many cases, we're going to see peasant unrest and rebellions across Mexico. Even before the Mexican Revolution began, there were already signs of instability in Mexico, that, again, this peasantry was going to explode at some point. There will be massive rebellion, in other words. And this became even more clear, more evident in the Yucatan Peninsula, when in 1847, for example, when this process of trying to dismantle the communal landholdings by the liberals that was accelerated in the 1850s, we see that the Mayas of Yucatan are going to stage a massive rebellion. This became known as the Caste Wars of Yucatan, something that started in 1847, and this is a rebellion that will continue all the way to 1915. Again, so this was an ongoing act of resistance, again, by the Mayas of Yucatan when they witnessed the dismantling of the CAJ, their corporate communities, in other words, the villages that were considered to be individual autonomous entities in which the members of the group owned the land in common. When those lands were privatized and turned to private investors or merchants or landowners to grow cash crops, and when they themselves, the Mayas, were turned into peons, those were debt laborers, they were indebted, to the landlord and were trying to pay the debt by work, never getting out of that cycle. Again, they pretty much burst in rebellion, and we see a massive, massive war that was very bloody. It was called the Caste War. They believed themselves to be a member of the indigenous caste, revolting against the upper caste, the Creoles or the Criollos, the heirs of the Spaniards, in other words, who are now Mexicans that were exploiting the indigenous masses. So this became a sort of like an indigenous war in which at the very core, at the very center of the war was the defense of land, the defense of culture, and also the defense of civilization. Okay, the caste wars, as you can see, lasted for many, many decades. They were in a state of resistance, and they were, by 1915 laid down their arms again. So there were clear signs that this process of privatization was going to create problems across Mexico. Something that erupted, as we'll see, in 1910. Now, there's also other groups, like, for example, industrial workers. Okay, industrial workers as well are going to organize due to the fact that the industrial working class in Mexico, those that were working, for example, in the construction of the railroads, those that were involved in the mining industries that are owned and operated by foreigners, Americans, or the oil industry. Again, they were receiving meager wages, below survival levels. And the other issue that they confronted is that the management, the supervisors, the owners, in other words, of those factories and industrial plants, were also foreigners as well. So there's going to be a growing sentiment here of nationalism, as we'll see, as the Mexican working class is really witnessing Mexican sovereignty being lost, and of course their rights being diminished as well as industrial workers. Like I mentioned, there are some sectors of the Mexican population that can be considered middle class. There are not a lot of them, but there are some. For example, mostly they are centered in the northern part of Mexico. Those are the cattle ranchers. Again, they're not really, cattle giants in this case. They're not really ranchers that own kingdoms here. Those are actually kind of middle class entrepreneurs. They own 100 acres, maybe more than that, and they have a cattle ranch going. And this is something that, by tradition, they have practiced for many, many generations. Trying to subsist from grazing and raising cattle and selling it again, or trading it, and so on. So it is here that we're going to see people like Álvaro Obregón and also Francisco Villa, the memorable Pancho Villa, for example, the revolutionary. Those were actually rancheros or cattle ranchers who were also affected by the entrance of the American companies. In many cases, they were also losing land to the Americans because the survey law that I mentioned, in many cases, were ceding territory or lands to American companies, and that included part of their own lands in the north. Álvaro Obregón also was a farmer. He was also using the land to grow grain for the market, and now he's being totally displaced by the American corporations growing grain in Mexico. They feel that they cannot compete with American companies because they just don't have the capital, they don't have the technology to do that. So they're being driven out of the market as well. Again, people like Álvaro Obregón. Now, the Mexican elite, it should be noted, also suffered setbacks by the liberal policies of Porfirio Diaz. There were certain families, very, very wealthy, also in the northern part of Mexico, like the Maderos, for example. The Maderos family from Coahuila, who had been involved in mining operations in the past. But now they're facing significant competition from the American smelting companies that are coming in, the Guggenheims as well, that really are global empires. Again, so Mexican elites are also suffering from American, capital, from American technology that is really driving them out of the market, driving them out of the business altogether, displacing them. And this is going to create dissent as well among the elite. This is very important because, again, there are members of the Mexican elite that feel that Diaz is giving preference to foreigners as opposed to protecting the domestic, to the domestic elites in this case. So again, this is going to be very, very key for understanding the revolution, that the revolution is going to bring together different classes of people, different groups, members of the elite with the middle class, with workers and peasants. At some point, they're going to coalesce to oust Diaz from power. At least initially, there's going to be an alliance across class lines, again, bringing different groups together. Now, last but not least, we're also going to see middle class individuals that, the intelligentsia, we were talking about the intelligentsia in session 1, the intellectuals, in other words, who are also critical of the Diaz regime, and they're already offering criticisms on the liberal policies and how those policies were leading to the disintegration of Mexican society. And again, they're going to provide the ideologies for revolution. Again, those are the revolutionary ideologues. Like, for example, Ricardo Flores Magón, an ideologue who was himself an anarcho-syndicalist. More precisely, he was an anarchist. But along those lines as well, trying to pretty much move the control of the industrial process back to the worker. The idea that it should be workers and peasants that should be in control of the means of production, their own tools, their own lands, and the like. Again, he was, an ideologue who was proposing a return to that idealized past where workers and peasants are pretty much in control of the economy. And he's blaming the state, like the anarcho-syndicalists do, again, for actually creating the inequalities in Mexico. Okay, and blaming Diaz, in other words, for the immiseration of the peasantry, the immiseration of the industrial working class, and the loss of sovereignty. And the means to disseminate some of those criticisms was by publishing those commentaries in newspaper articles. He opened up a newspaper called The Regeneration, or La Regeneración, the regeneration. He was really calling for the regeneration of Mexico. Okay, that Mexico needed to be cleansed, in other words, of modernity. In this case, the aspects of industrial capitalism, the way it was managed and implemented, that was foreign managed, the imposition of foreign control and the like, and the removal of Diaz again. So it was a very radical newspaper. And Diaz, of course, persecuted Ricardo Flores Magón, closed his newspaper, and Ricardo Flores Magón and his brother had to go to the United States, places like Los Angeles and San Antonio, Texas, to continue this process of publishing articles on this newspaper that came into Mexico from the northern border. Again, this is, pretty much beginning the process of the revolution itself, the revolution of ideas. Another ideologue was Enrique Andrés Molina, who was also a critic of the Diaz regime, and he published a book, actually, that was widely read before the revolution began. It was called The Great National Problems, in Spanish, Los Grandes Problemas Nacionales. What that means is that he's really looking at Mexico and he's making an assessment of the liberal policies of Diaz and, modernization in Mexico. And, what he's actually saying is that modernization came at a great cost, particularly to the indigenous peoples of Mexico. That the indigenous peoples of Mexico, which constituted the vast majority of the population, it should be noted, indigenous peoples of Mexico constituted more than 60% of the population in Mexico in general. That the indigenous population has lost all rights. Their lands have been taken away. They've been turned into a workforce to be exploited. and their cultures were being destroyed in the process. So he called for land reform. This idea that, we should return the lands to the indigenous peoples to save that civilization again. And so that really created a commotion also in Mexico, pretty much bringing awareness to the real problems, again, that Mexico was facing. That led, of course, to the immediate events leading to the Mexican Revolution itself. The spark of the revolution occurred with the presidential election of 1910. Diaz is trying to run for yet another term in 1910. He's been serving for 34 years in Mexico, and now he wants to be reelected, okay, to continue this process. Now he's facing significant challenge. In this case, Francisco Madero. Remember the elites from Coahuila who are resentful at the Diaz policies of inviting the Americans and preferring the Americans over Mexican elites. So Madero is going to challenge Diaz at the ballot box, and he's calling for democracy. Diaz has been there for too long, he said. Madero is saying, look, Diaz is a dictator, and what we need is clean elections. What we need is a system of democratic elections in which there will be no re-election. In other words, he's really calling for that kind of reform, that no one that serves a term should be re-elected. Okay, no re-election. And clean elections as well. Now, the election comes around in 1910, and Diaz controls the electoral machine, and he declares himself the winner of the contest. Madero does not acknowledge the results, and he then moves to rally the masses and calls for revolution. He goes to San Luis Potosí, it's a state in Mexico, and he drafts actually a document which really was a call for arms, so to speak. In other words, for all Mexicans to rise up against Diaz. So this is a clear, again, call for revolution, a challenge to the Diaz regime directly. Okay, so there will be across Mexico many groups that will attend Madero's call for revolt. There are plenty of disgruntled groups, social classes that will be more than willing to move forward and begin this process of removing Diaz by force. There are the peons. Once again, those are the indebted laborers, many of whom are indigenous, who are really virtual slaves at this point, that want to earn their freedom and they want their land back. There are, of course, the rancheros, the cattle ranchers from the north, and industrial workers. They're in rebellion. Again, and they're being led by, for example, in the south, by Emiliano Zapata, who was himself an hacendado, and he becomes the champion of the indigenous population, the dispossessed indigenous population that want their lands to be returned. So he's really representing the peasantry. He's representing the indigenous population again in the south, Zapata. In the north, we're going to see a cattle rancher, Pancho Villa, representing the rancheros, the ranchers, in other words, middle-class rancheros who want also the restoration of their lands, and they want to drive out the foreigners as well. Again, very clearly. Zapata is also calling for the expulsion of the foreigners as well. And the workers are also revolting. They're creating the very first national syndicate or union. They call it the Casa del Obrero, the house of the laborer in this case. Trying to unite all workers across Mexico from multiple industries into a single syndicate to provide representation and, of course, to stage a revolt against the Diaz regime. Now, in 1911, Diaz finally, because he's unable to put down the revolt everywhere, he steps down and he's, leaving the country. He's moving to France, in exile. But, before he leaves, he actually turns back and says to Madero, I hope you can handle this beast that you just unleashed. Again, let's see if you can tame it. In other words, because Diaz was very well aware how difficult it was to keep order within Mexico with so many different factions, that offer resistance. And this is, again, going to be a major challenge of Madero. As soon as he becomes president in 1911, he's holding power. He's going to be facing pressure from every side. The rancheros from the north, the industrial workers, for example, the indigenous population, and also the Americans. The Americans want guaranteed that Madero was not going to nationalize American assets. So again, he's really, pressure on all fronts. And finally, in 1913, Madero suffers an assassination by one of Diaz's generals, who was very loyal to Diaz, General Victoriano Huerta. He stages a coup on Madero, assassinates Madero and his vice president at the same time, and he declares himself to be the dictator of Mexico, starting in 1913. So what we see now is a military dictatorship that represents the Diaz, pretty much, regime. Now, Diaz is out of the picture. He's in France, but Victoriano Huerta is here to kind of continue this process of modernization forward, by force, trying to kind of quell the revolutionaries by force, using the federal forces, moving them all over the country and fight everybody. In other words, so again, this really united a great many forces in Mexico to battle Huerta and the dictatorship. Whether they were poor, middle class, indigenous, or wealthy, they're all going to coalesce together to remove Huerta from power. And this is exactly what happened finally in 1914. Huerta could not really withstand so much opposition. And once Huerta is out of the picture, he steps down. Now, all the forces that have united in the past to oust Huerta from power, they're now contesting power again. So there's a vacuum of power in Mexico, and all the revolutionary forces are trying to seize control of Mexico. So this is now transitioning from a revolution to a civil war. Again, this is the second stage of the Mexican Revolution from 1914 to 1919. Again, it's actually a civil war. And really, all the different parties of Mexico divide themselves mainly into two different camps. Each camp offered a very different vision for the future of Mexico. Okay? And so, what was that? Okay, so on one hand, we have, of course, one vision of Mexico represented by the peasantry, the small ranchers, and the workers. They're best represented by Villa and Zapata. Again, Villa is in the north, Zapata is in the south, and they represent the lower classes, so to speak, lower middle classes. Okay, what they want is the restoration of their lands and limit U.S. presence. Very, very simple. Okay, so again, they're very, very nationalistic in this case. The second group, the opposing camp, they're made up of the large landowners, Mexican elites, and middle-class ranchers and farmers. They're represented by very large landowners like Venustiano Carranza and the middle-class rancher and farmer Álvaro Obregón. And they became known as the constitutionalists, or los constitucionalistas, the constitutionalists. They want to introduce a constitutional republic in Mexico that will have orderly elections and no re-election for any president. And also they want to limit U.S. investment. Not do away completely with U.S. investment, but limit U.S. investment. Okay? And territorially, this is pretty much how, the Civil War looked like. Again, what we have in red, of course, is really the more popular classes, indigenous, peons, workers, ranchers, battling the constitutionalists that control pretty much the center part of Mexico, and they're more well-to-do, in other words. So we have two very different visions of the future here. Now, at some point, however, the Americans who had invested about $1 billion in Mexico are quite worried. They're growing very worried about, which group is going to win. Of course, so they have to throw their lot into one group or the other. And they are going to do that in 1914. There will be a sort of like intervention of sorts to protect American interests. In this case, the constitutionalist, the more well-to-do, in other words, faction, represented by large landowners, middle-class ranchers, and so on, was the best option. Here, Carranza, the leader of this group, declares himself president, and he has the backing, of course, of Americans to do so, but it was not enough, again, to get just the diplomatic recognition, again, from the United States, that, okay, you are going to be now the recognized, of course, leader of Mexico, because obviously Carranza is facing significant pressure from Villa and Zapata, okay, who represent, the more popular classes. So to tilt the scale in favor of the constitutionalist, Americans are going to provide, of course, aid, funding, and weapons, in this case, to the constitutionalists. The way they do that is that they seize the port of Veracruz in the Gulf of Mexico, and they leave significant amount of war materials that are really superior to anything that Mexicans at this point have available, and that includes, of course, things like machine guns, etc., grenades and the like, the kind of weaponry that was used at the time in World War I, in other words. So again, this is, high-tech stuff. So, that is left there for Carranza to take advantage of, and it is really in the Battle of Celaya, the following year in 1915, when Obregón, the general of the Constitutionalists, was battling Villa, the middle-class ranchers, in this Battle of Celaya, and Obregón just decimates Villa's army. It was just, shocking to everybody how Villa, which is such a very large force of ranchers, was decimated, by Obregón rather quickly. And, the reason for that has to do with the kind of equipment or, technologies that Obregón was using, which was just superior, by every metric. So again, Villa, from that point onwards, will never recover. What we see is Villa just remaining in the north, just as a rebel, but we're not going to see a major challenge, in other words, to Carranza. And of course, Carranza goes on to create the very first constitutional republic in 1917. They have a constitutional convention, and they draft the Constitution of 1917 in Mexico. It is really a nationalist document that stated Mexico for Mexicans, in other words, prohibited foreign ownership of resources and land. It nationalized foreign-owned land holdings, like American companies owning land, for example, and pretty much confiscated those lands, gained them back, and also imposed taxes on foreign companies, in other words. Not that it removed the presence of Americans, but it started taxing, in other words, American companies. It also was a social justice document in that it granted rights to workers and peasants, but the problem was that those rights were not really enforced. There was no, again, law or provision to actually enforce workers' rights, to limit, for example, exploitation, to start distributing land back to the indigenous peoples, etc. Again, those provisions will have to wait, because, again, this enormous pressure that is being felt by the heirs of the revolution that are seizing power, like Obregón, for example, in 1920, he becomes president of Mexico, and he himself was facing significant challenges from the industrial working class, the anarcho-syndicalists. They are up in arms. They're in revolt across Mexico. They want total control of industry, in other words. They want the workers to control their own schedules, to control their own pace of work, to make decisions at the workplace, and they want to limit the presence of foreigners as well in the country. Now, the other pressure is that Mexico has a debt to repay to the Americans, and the Americans are also pressuring Obregón for the debt. Again, so this is what Obregón is actually facing. Should we pursue the nationalist goals, to provide social justice to peasants and workers and so on, or the American pressure? Again, so again, he is really in a crux here. He is really in a very difficult predicament. So the American, of course, commission in Mexico, the so-called Bankers Committee, come in and pressure Obregón to sign a treaty. The idea was for the bankers, many of whom were connected to American companies, that they wanted their American interests to be safe and protected. They did not want any nationalization of any of the industries that the United States had created. And Obregón signed that treaty. It was called the Bucareli Treaty in 1923, whereby he agrees not to nationalize, for example, the oil industry or the mining industries that were owned by Americans, only the lands, in other words, that they had bought in the past, to give it back to Mexico. Again, so that was the agreement in order to protect the debt, in other words. Now, here we see the rise of one-party state. The revolutionaries, at least those who survived the revolution, the generals, end up creating a single party. One of the generals was Plutarco Elias Calles in 1929, and he's the one who created the PRI, or the PRI, as it is called, the Party of the Revolution. And so the reason for doing this is because Mexico was so disintegrated, it was falling apart. There were so many different groups pulling the state apart. So he comes up with a very clever, solution, and that is create a party that will include everybody into the government, into the party. Okay, that everybody was going to receive some form of concessions. Instead of a party that will favor one group over another and split, of course, loyalties in Mexican society, he wanted to pretty much include everybody. In other words, the peasants, to include the workers, to include the business class, to include the landowners and bureaucrats, that everybody's going to be a member of the party. And if you're a member of the party, you are going to be included and you have some form of benefit or another, in other words. Again, so this is, again, a kind of practical solution to provide unity in the country when the country was very, very divided, still with the spirit of the revolution. And it is not until another general comes into office, Lázaro Cárdenas, in 1934, in which we see yet another expression of this chaos that was plaguing Mexico, despite the fact that there's a party that is including everybody. The fact is that there are still a number of groups that are disaffected and their problems have not been addressed, like the anarcho-syndicalists, that are trying to create a labor movement in Mexico, and they are complaining about foreign management, for example, the foreigners in Mexico. So there is this kind of pressure, the presence of the foreigners in this case. The peasants haven't yet received their lands. The fact is that, again, land reform has not yet occurred. It's on paper, but the peasantry is still dispossessed. So Lázaro Cárdenas says we need reform, because if we don't address the problems of the workers and the peasants, we're going to have another revolution. In other words, so he introduces then a series of reforms. The first one is the restoration of El Ejido. Again, this is the communal land holdings. He's going to seize land from the major landholders and also American companies and return those lands back to the peasants. Again, so there's a major shift in policy here, the reversal of that liberal policy, as now the peasantry is now gaining back their lost lands. Again, and that is to prevent revolution, and also the nationalization of the oil industry in 1938. It was in the hands of the Standard Oil of New Jersey, and it was now nationalized. There's a massive labor strike that paralyzes that industry. And again, Lázaro Cárdenas and that foreign-owned industry has no other option but to pretty much give it up. Part of the reason has to do with events unfolding in Europe. The beginning of World War II. World War II is about to explode, in other words, the following year. So one of the reasons why Americans also let that industry go is because they wanted, of course, to continue making deals. In other words, in Mexico, obtaining the benefits of the oil industry, again, having Mexico as an ally, in other words. And so they let it go, in other words. And, Cárdenas created Mexico's oil industry, Pemex, as it is called. And again, this was also a major reversal of the liberal policies of Diaz. Now, there's a compromise with Americans, of course. And the compromise is that Americans will continue to be invited into Mexico, bringing their capital, technologies, investment. But the idea is that the Mexican elite will have more participation. Okay, Mexicans, again, at least the elite, they want to be senior partners here, in other words, to be on top of the game, in other words. They also want to tax more the U.S. companies, limit their operations, and in return, Mexico is going to suppress labor radicalism, in other words, control the labor force, in other words, suppress it, and with this create a kind of balance, in the system. So again, those are the kind of changes that transpired in Mexico as a result of the liberal policies of Diaz and the reaction to that produces the Mexican Revolution. At the end of the day, Americans are still in Mexico, but again, they're operating quite limited, at least throughout the 20th century. Again, this is the situation. All right, now part 3 is going to move into the initial stages of the Russian Revolution. We're going to leave for session 3 the actual revolution itself, and after that, we're going to cover China, the Chinese Revolution. As we did with Mexico, it's important to note that this is another revolution that opened up in the initial years of the 20th century, and it will be a far more significant revolution for the world at large, meaning that the Russian Revolution will have a greater impact, in other words, in societies around the world, to the point that many of the revolutions of the 20th century are going to follow the footsteps of the Russian model, more so than the Mexican model. The Mexican model will have some influence in Latin America, some influence in Latin American revolutions, but it was really the Russian Revolution that will have an influence on pretty much revolutions elsewhere around the world. Okay, so it is a very, very important development, phenomenon, that is also reacting against the process of modernization, just like the Mexican Revolution. It will take a different turn, it will walk a different path, so to speak, but nonetheless, this is also a very, very important revolution. Okay, let's look at the origins and background, okay, just like what we did with Mexico. The origins and background of the Russian Revolution also have to do with liberal reforms implemented, in this case, by the czarist regime. The czar, as we talked about in session and in the previous topic, in topic 7, when we look at modernization in Russia, really, Russia has a czarist government that is absolute. And this is something that is emerging as early as the 1500s. The Tsar is really the emperor, and he's the absolute ruler of Russia. And the Tsar is going to start pushing a series of reforms starting around the 1600s to start changing Russia's economy, particularly, not the political system. Again, the Tsars do not want to turn the political system into a liberal democracy. That's very clear. Okay, they don't want a system of elections. They don't want to grant rights to their subjects. They're not really trying to provide representation. What they're trying to do is they're trying to transform the Russian economy to become more productive, to generate more revenues, more wealth. In this case, for the state. Okay, so the kind of reforms that we're looking at are economic reforms. Again, the liberal reforms. Something akin to what happened also in Latin America with this authoritarian modernization, in other words. And it all started in 1640 when Russia was trying to move the economy to the market, the agricultural economy. Remember, those are agricultural economies in the hands of landlords, landowners, and peasants are working the land to sustain themselves and the like. But this system is not very productive. This subsistence system of just trying to grow your own food to sustain, the village, to sustain the family, to sustain the landlord, to sustain the state, that's not really generating, monies, in other words. Now, there's a huge market in Western Europe as a result of a population growth. In the 1600s, the population of Europe is rebounding from the ravages of the Black Death. And as the population is increasing, there's a growing demand for grain and food products. So there's money to be made there. So the Russian Tsar is trying to now turn the agricultural sector of Russia to that market, to the Western European market. In order to do that, he wants to secure labor. So in 1640, as he's moving the economy towards commerce, the production of cash crops to feed the populations of Europe, he's also trying to secure the labor. And here he introduces a law in which he legalizes serfdom. Okay, serfdom is just the condition of an individual who is turned into a virtual slave. In other words, that belongs to the land. That the person that is working the land, in this case the peasant, as he's now turning into a serf, that he is now a piece of property. He's part of the land that he's working on or she's working on. And that person that cannot be separated from the land as well. So if the land is to be sold, it has to be sold along with the serfs, along, with it. Okay, they're part of the same entity, in other words. That's what a serf is. The reason why he did that was to secure the labor force required to grow the cash crops for exports, in other words, in 1640. And after that, the state is also trying to develop other sectors of the economy, like mines, for example, workshops as well for manufacturing as well, large estates, and the state is in total control of the economy. So this is a state-led process of trying to modernize the economy, again, just the economy, once again, trying to turn the economy more productive. All right, so this is how this process got started. However, in the 1860s, the Russian Tsar is going to realize that this system was not very efficient, that certain changes needed to be done in Russia, certain reforms. And the reason for that has to do with a war that broke out between Russia against France and Britain. It's called the Crimean War. Started in 1854 and it lasted for a couple of years. This war, as we'll see, led to the liberation of the serfs in 1861. Again, this war itself. And the reason for that is because Russia lost the war. Again, the Crimean War. It was fighting this war in its own territory, in its own borders, against foreign powers that were coming up, from 1,000 miles away. So how is it that this great empire, the Russian Empire, is losing a war that is fighting in its own soil, so to speak, against foreign powers that are coming from so far away? So what that means is that the French and the British are far more advanced technologically, economically, scientifically, militarily than Russia itself. So Russia believes that, again, the Tsar, that Russia needed to catch up with the West, in other words, that this is a sign that we're still backward, that we're not really, efficient in handling the economy. We're relying on old systems of labor, feudalism, for example, serfdom, and the like. So he decides to let the serfs go in 1861. And there is, of course, a massive liberation of serfs. There were about 40%. Sometimes historians talk about 50% of the Russian population were enserfed. And now they're being liberated in order to, again, to provide incentives for those liberated peoples to own their own land and to become more productive, to inject some dynamism, in other words, some energy, some vitality into agriculture. So there will be more innovation, more creativity. In other words, when people own their own land, that's actually what happens. And, but this liberation came at a cost in that this liberation was not free. They will get land, it's true, but they will have to pay for it. And they will have to pay a debt, in other words. So this created a forced land sale in which peasants, in this case, or farmers that are now in control of their own land, will have to make payments again to their village authorities, and the village authorities will give these monies, those monies, they'll give them to the large landowners from which their own properties were disintegrated. Because in order to create land distribution in Russia, large landowners had to give up a great portion of their own lands to give it to the peasantry in this case. And again, the large landowners wanted some form of compensation. So again, that emancipation came at a great cost. It liberated the peasants, but at the same time, it tied them to the land. Now the land is theirs, but this is also making sure that Russia will continue to have a workforce producing cash crops. You're liberating the serfs, you're giving them land, but now they're tied to the land because they have to pay a debt. And that will, create, of course, the condition of a perpetual workforce that will continue to generate cash crops for exports as well. Okay, so again, those reforms were piecemeal. They were not really, meant to truly provide freedom and liberation to the peasantry, but rather a quite gradual, liberation. Now, this process of modernization also came at a great cost to the peasantry, because after all, more reform was needed. In this process of trying to reform the Russian economy, the peasantry is going to bear most of the burden for the changes taking place. I mean, this is something that occurred also in Mexico. Again, the peasantry was the one actually, paying the bill. In other words, for the change, losing their lands, and at the same time, they're tied to the land, growing cash crops as peons, etc. But here we see a slight different process. There is a government minister by the name of Serge Whitty, who served from 1892 to 1903, who was really the architect of this liberal regime, trying to implement, of course, capitalism in agriculture. Again, trying to bring in capitalism in agriculture. And the way to do this, he believed, was to dismantle the peasant land holdings. Something that we saw in Mexico as well with Ley Lerdo. The privatization of the mir. Mir, again, in Russia, was the peasant land holdings, the village peasant council that was in control of the land, and every member of the village owned the land in common. And he said that this is a very archaic, backward, system that is preventing Russia from modernizing. We need a capitalist system in which we see private ownership of the land, and we need to put this land to the market so private investors will buy it, merchants, and this is going to turn the land more productive. Again, we need capitalist investment, capitalist entrepreneurs to come in and, of course, revolutionize agriculture. So again, the peasants are losing ground because their lands are being privatized. Many of them did not have the wherewithal to buy land themselves, so many of them were evicted from their lands. The other policy that this minister implemented was a protective tariff, meaning that he was forcing now the peoples of Russia to buy the domestic product, in order to foster internal development and protect Russian industries. He said, well, we need to start taxing very heavily all import items, import goods, for example. That might cost less money than the domestic products, and that included things like machinery, for example, and fertilizer. Again, barbed wire, all the equipment, all the technologies that farmers and peasants needed to grow cash crops in Russia are going to cost a lot of money if you wanted to continue buying it from foreign companies like German or British, for example, companies. Now you have to buy it from Russian companies at a very elevated price. And this is, of course, hurting the economy of farmers and peasants, and this is going to create massive poverty among the peasantry as well. Okay, so this is again hurting the interests of the lower classes, particularly again farmers and peasants. Now, there's also the issue of foreign investment and industrialization. I mean, this is something we saw in Mexico with Diaz. You know, he opened the doors to Americans. Now, here in the 1860s, the czars are not necessarily opening the doors to Americans. They're opening the doors to Western European investors. Okay, and particularly French, British, and German. And what they're allowed to do is to bring in their capital, their technology to develop industry. Now, this massive industrial production now, okay? We're not just talking about a handful of industries. Again, the doors of Russia are total, if you will, for foreigners to come in and develop massive industrial plants, to develop railroads, factories, again, in order to spur development, steel, for example, production, iron, and so on. Again, this is what Russia was interested. Particularly, we're going to see in two main cities, in Petrograd, in Moscow, the development of those industrial centers. And indeed, industrial production skyrocketed. We mentioned in the previous topic that Russia was creating a sort of like an industrial miracle of sorts, with a kind of economic growth of about 16% per year of growth, economic growth in terms of output, industrial output. Again, so it was indeed very, very significant as the Russian economy was skyrocketing. Now, there's going to be, just like in Mexico, a reaction to modernization. Okay, obviously, and that is going to come on several fronts. Again, it's very important to note that there will be different groups that will be disaffected by this process of modernization, particularly, again, the privatization of lands that are turning the peasant land holdings to the marketplace for private ownership, and the entrance of foreigners, in this case, to develop industries. And number one, of course, we see the peasantry, very, very disaffected. They have lost entitlements to their lands. Their lands are being privatized en masse. And also the local gentry, those are like middle class farmers, are also suffering by the tariffs that we spoke about as well. Now, the idea that, look, we have to pay a lot of prices, again, for fertilizers and machinery, technologies, again. And again, this is not really cost effective. And in many cases, they will have to sell their product, all their grain, to the state, to the Russian government, at the prices dictated by the state itself, when they were buying low. Again, the state was really buying at very low prices the grain produced by the local gentry, again, the middle class farmers. So they was hurting their economy directly. Now, of course, the nobility, the Russian nobility, was also losing land and also standing as well. Many of their land holdings were being taken away in order to privatize those lands. And of course, their standing as well as noblemen, in other words, were also, again, being reduced and diminished with the rise of a capitalist class. Again, we see the rise of investors and merchants, industrialists, who are slowly but surely displacing the old nobility. So we see the rise of a new rich, if you will, in Russia as well. Not to mention, of course, the industrial workers who are working in Petrograd, otherwise known as St. Petersburg, and also in Moscow, in industrial plants that have, of course, very, very worsening working conditions. They work long hours, 12, 14 hours a day, with no safety guidelines or regulations in the workplace. And they live in company towns. The fact is that as those workers were migrating from the countryside, those were actually peasants that have lost entitlements to the land. They were forced to move to the industrial centers in pursuit of wages. They're now working for an industry, and they were forced to live in company towns. Those were actually industrial types of housing projects, so to speak, and they were overcrowded with limited services, and each industrial plant housed about 8,000 workers. So again, conditions were wretched, to say the least. And to top it off, again, the management and the owners of those industries were foreigners. You got British or French, you got German, of course, supervisors, and the management as a whole, again, they're all foreigners. And this is going to lead, of course, to nationalist sentiments as well, something that, similarly that we saw in Mexico. Now, we're going to put a stop here because we have run out of time. But when we come back, we're going to continue looking at the immediate events leading to the Russian Revolution for about half an hour or so. And then the remaining portion of part 3 will be devoted to the Chinese Revolution. Again, we're going to conclude with that, looking at China and the revolution. And at the end, we're looking at summary points, just offering a summary of the world revolutions. Everything will be explained when we come back. Coming next. Thank you.